Tonight, you're not walking into a case that wants to be solved. You're walking into a valley that learned how to keep secrets professionally. Before you fall asleep, you'll follow a trail of small, stubborn evidence, a body burned past recognition, a suitcase in Bergen with every label cut away, and a notebook that counts trips in tidy pairs but never explains why. You'll meet a woman who slept in 12 beds under 9 names, paid in cash, asked for quiet rooms, and left behind almost nothing except the feeling that the details were arranged on purpose. Frost sits on heather like a thin, careful powder. A match hisses out and the smoke seems to apologize for existing. In a narrow valley, a crow counts the echoes, 1, 2, then silence again, as if even the air is taking inventory. The wind tastes of metal and rain, the kind that clings to zippers and keys. Somewhere nearby, a hiking path keeps going as if nothing happened, which is often how mysteries begin. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, perhaps the next soft sound of footsteps on wet stone will remember you there, half awake, while the valley holds its file closed and the labels stay burned clean. Because tonight's story doesn't start with a confession. It starts with missing names and a suitcase that refuses to introduce its owner. You might not expect a woman to disappear so completely that even her clothing tags feel shy about it, but that is what happens in the Isdal Valley case, where the most stubborn witnesses are a scorched label, a quiet suitcase, and a notebook that refuses to be a diary. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the screen glow be a small, polite moon. Let the air do what it does when everyone else stops trying to manage it. There is a kind of cold that doesn't feel dramatic, just organized. It sits on heather as frost and makes every rock look as if it has been thinking for a long time. In late 1970, outside Bergen, in a place called Isdal, someone moving through the valley notices smoke, or the suggestion of it, as if the landscape has been practicing a small, private campfire and then changed its mind. The air tastes a little like metal and rain, the way a zipper tastes if you lick it by accident, and the ground holds its own quiet inventory. Stones, twigs, a small slope, and the faint idea that something has happened here that will not become a neat sentence. A body is found on the hillside, burned enough to make recognition feel like a rude question. There are hints that certain things were arranged, or at least left in a way that suggests intention, the way someone might fold a blanket casually and still manage to put the corners exactly in line. Nothing about the valley is in a hurry. The heather does not rush to explain itself. The wind does not raise its hand. If you imagine the moment, it is mostly small sounds, someone's breath, a foot on gravel, a match perhaps, though matches are always taking credit for things they didn't start. There's no tent, no stove, no clear little domestic scene to make the mind feel comfortable. And that absence is oddly specific, like opening a fridge and discovering only a single lemon and it has been turned the right way up. Later, police will mark areas with string, the way people outline a parking spot with cones, except this is not a parking lot, and the valley does not respect string. The valley is older than procedure. It keeps the rest. It is easy in stories for a discovery to become a big drumbeat, a turning point, a sharp intake. But what often happens in real investigations is that it becomes paperwork. The first drama is a pencil. Someone writes down time, weather, position, and the first descriptions that are always too plain and too careful. Female, unidentified, burned, words that try very hard not to feel anything. And somewhere nearby, almost in the same breath as the discovery, the mind begins to do what minds do at night. It reaches for labels because labels are a kind of blanket. It is not cruel. It is simply sleepy. Soon the case moves, as cases like this often do, from hillside to station, from air to fluorescent lighting. A key leads to Bergen Station, and a suitcase waits in a locker like a closed mouth that has decided not to gossip. Luggage lockers are a strange invention if you think about them. They are tiny rented caves for objects. You feed them coins, you close the metal door, and you walk away with a key as if you have not just entrusted your belongings to a publicly accessible box in a busy place. It is the kind of behavior that only makes sense because everyone else is doing it, like wearing shoes inside or discussing the weather as if it is new. When the locker is opened, the suitcase has the particular smell of travel, fabric warmed by trains, a hint of cosmetic powder, and things that have been handled too many times without being truly owned. Inside are clothes, wigs, objects chosen for usefulness rather than affection. There are spoons of German make, which sounds romantic until you realize it mostly means spoons from Germany, and a prescription vial that has been scraped clean in a way that suggests someone didn't want the label, didn't want the name, didn't want even the idea of a pharmacist's handwriting. There is no passport, just fragments, maps, cosmetics, and a notebook that looks ordinary the way a calm face looks ordinary until it begins to avoid your eyes. The strangest detail, and the most quietly comic, is the attention paid to labels. Many of the garments have had their makers' labels cut away as if branding is contagious. Someone took scissors to the small rectangles of fabric that normally say, made in, and then a country. The way modern people remove the tag from a new shirt because it scratches except here. It scratches the identity instead. And that is a different kind of itch. It is like someone trying to browse the world in incognito mode, but using cloth and thread and doing it manually, one label at a time, which is dedication of the most tedious kind. If you want a mild micro-hook to stay awake on, it is this. The most suspicious tool in the story is not a gun or a secret code, but a pair of plain scissors that probably also cut wrapping paper at some point. Under the station's fluorescent lights, zippers tick and metal catches the glare. The suitcase has been packed to be untraceable, which is a very ambitious goal for a suitcase, because suitcases are inherently conspicuous. They are basically portable rectangles that announce, "Hello, I have been places." Even the most discreet suitcase still looks like a suitcase, and a suitcase in a locker is already a confession. But there it is, an effort to become unnameable, surrounded by the ordinary infrastructure of travel keys, counters, timetables, the gentle cruelty of waiting. From there, the case begins to grow a second life, the life it lives in other people's rooms, hotel rooms, office rooms, the small rooms inside police stations where coffee lives too long on a hot plate. Names appear not as a single neat identity, but as a stack of registrations. Across Norway and beyond, hotel cards and guest books fill with versions of the same woman. 9 aliases are connected to her. And what is impressive is not only the number, but the steady, practical way she seems to use them. She arrives alone, asks for a quiet room, pays cash, and prefers corner tables she can watch from. This is, in its own way, extremely relatable. Many of us prefer corner tables. Many of us prefer paying in ways that do not leave a trail. We just call it avoiding the subscription we forgot to cancel, and she called it something else. Hotel clerks notice things that feel trivial until later. A strong perfume that lingers in hallways as if it paid for an extra night. A dark hair tint that sometimes looks a little off because hair dye is a liar and always has been. A habit of asking about views, which is either a romantic impulse or an intelligence habit, or simply the normal human desire to see what is outside the window. Sometimes after she leaves, the bins hold little. The mirror holds nothing. She smooths her presence out of the room like someone making a bed in a hurry, flattening wrinkles so no one can guess how she slept. There are small routines that repeat. She checks in, she chooses rooms with particular positions, she moves on. The effect is like watching someone play a very slow board game with hotel lobbies. taking small pieces off the board and replacing them with cash. In some places, she is described as speaking with a foreign accent, and even that seems to shift, as if the accent is another garment whose label can be cut out, which is, if you think about it, quite a lot of work. Most people can barely maintain a consistent tone in a text message, and then there's the notebook. Not a diary in the way people imagine diaries, with feelings and dramatic underlining. Instead, it is closer to a ledger, the kind of small book that would make an accountant nod politely. It contains numbers in the margin, coded into tidy pairs, as if someone wanted to turn travel into mathematics. Police compare departures to arrivals, and the grid begins to whisper a route. Each line can resolve into a date and a place, like a train schedule that forgot it was supposed to carry people. But there is no reason, no name, no clear why. Just movement, measured and repeated, like someone pacing in a long corridor for years and calling it commuting. If you want to let your body soften while we talk about coded notations, you can breathe in for 4 and out for 6. In for 4, out for 6. It is a small metronome, like the tick of a station clock that does not care what you're waiting for. Facts align. Meaning stays seated. Meaning doesn't stand up unless you invite it, and tonight we are not inviting it very loudly. In the third part of this quiet journey, the case becomes medical without becoming emotional. Forensic work is, at its heart, an exercise in patience and understatement. Teeth are examined. Dental work is compared to other dental work, which sounds like the dullest kind of matching game. A person's enamel can suggest one region, certain clinic styles can suggest another. It is the kind of evidence that looks like nothing, just teeth, just fillings, until you realize it is a map that lives inside the mouth. In a world of passports and documents, a filling is stubbornly honest. No one thinks to cut its label out with scissors. Then there are the tablets. Phenobarbital is mentioned in reports, and it sits there on the page with a heavy chemical calm. Clothing is examined for traces of paraffin, soot, small residues that might come from travel or from choices or from accidents that don't announce themselves. Fingertips are read as if they have been persuaded to forget. And this is where you can almost hear the soft humor of science, because the human body refuses to be tidy. But the lab insists on trying, and the result is a kind of polite argument. The microscope says, "Here is something," and the world says, "Yes, but what does it mean?" And the microscope says, "I did my part." Witnesses remember a foreign accent that moved a little in each city, which is an oddly tender detail, like a familiar song played slightly out of tune in each new room. Some remember sunglasses on a cloudy day, which is the kind of eccentricity that would, in modern times, simply mean trying to have a vibe. Others remember her as well-dressed, controlled, a woman who seems to know what she is doing, even if what she is doing is merely buying a ticket and standing calmly while weather happens. And all of this teeth, tablets, soot, accent sits alongside the most unromantic elements of travel: receipts, tickets, ferry routes, a taxi driver's memory of 2 suitcases, a shop's memory of a scarf, because scarves are memorable, and also because a scarf is a portable piece of identity that does not require a passport. A clerk remembers that she asked about directions, or that she asked about the view, or that she spoke in a tone that suggested she had asked the same question in many towns before. Receipts stop on a date that the key explains, and the suitcase explains nothing. The file closes for the night, the questions do not. In a way, this is how mysteries actually behave. They are not constant fireworks. They are mostly folders. Someone stamps, someone files, someone makes tea that gets cold, and somewhere outside, a train leaves on time without caring. The mind wants a grand reveal, but the case offers the opposite. A long list of small certainties that refuse to connect into a comforting shape, which is, inconveniently, also how many historical records feel. Not because history is dramatic, but because history is incomplete. We inherit what survives, and what survives is often what was easiest to store: paper, numbers, labels, keys. Now, if you're re-noticing the title in your mind, Norway is Spy Mystery with burned labels and 9 fake names, you can let the word spy loosen a little. A spy is a loud idea. This case is quiet. Theories exist, of course, because humans manufacture theories the way bees manufacture wax, patiently, obsessively, and in hexagons if possible. Espionage is the loud guess. People mention missile tests nearby, routes that shadow ports, habits that waste no traces. Smuggling is the quieter won valuables that travel well, meetings that prefer corners and cash. There are also theories that are almost domestic: a private fight from a past, a marriage, a debt, a name she chose to end. Each idea holds for a page, then loosens at the spine, because paper can only carry so much weight before it becomes fiction. Sometimes the most honest theory is simply: a person constructed distance. She built it with hotel rooms and small lies. She erased labels. She paid cash. She spoke carefully, and the world, being the world, allowed it, because systems are made to move people through, not to hold them still. A hotel wants your money and your signature. A station wants your coins and your luggage in a box. A train wants you to board and then become a blur in the window. Nobody wants to ask, very loudly, "Who are you?" because it makes the line longer. It makes the evening inconvenient. It makes the clerk's shift feel personal. You can imagine the case file itself as a tired object now, thickening with photographs, notes, translations, small arrows drawn in pencil, and the occasional coffee stain that becomes, accidentally, part of the record. It sits in an office like an old book that never quite gets returned. Investigators come and go, techniques improve, ideas change shape, and yet the valley remains cool and indifferent, holding its original posture. The station clock turns. The lockers exist for the next traveler. The scissors in someone's bag cut something else. If you want a final micro hook to hold gently and then let go, consider how much of identity is made of things that seem too small to matter. A label stitched into a dress. A hotel clerk's memory of perfume. A spoon's country of manufacture. A pair of sunglasses on the wrong day. We act as if names are solid, but in practice, names are paperwork. They are agreements. They are like keys, small metal shapes that either turn or don't. And if a person carries 9 keys and uses each one once, the doors still open and the hallways still look the same. So keep facts in one jar valley, suitcase, aliases, code, and keep stories in another labeled light, open rarely. Add one small check tomorrow if you feel like it. Remove one dramatic certainty tonight and let the mind rest without insisting on a final sentence. If a new detail arrives, let it touch only what it matches and leave the rest sleeping. The heather holds its frost. The station clock keeps its steady circle. Somewhere, a suitcase is only a suitcase again, and a notebook is only a notebook, and the file waits quietly with its labels burned clean, as if it could wait forever and you could drift off beside it, listening to the soft sound of unanswered things being placed carefully back on the shelf. You might not expect the most dramatic thing on a Victorian railway platform to be an unclaimed umbrella, but railways have always been good at producing quiet mysteries with blunt handles. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air do its soft work. Picture a station that smells faintly of coal, damp wool, and yesterday's newspaper. The benches have that particular polish that comes from 1,000 anxious hands. Somewhere a timetable hangs like a solemn hymn, insisting that time can be organized if everyone behaves. And then, almost as a side effect of all this order, objects begin to slip away from their owners. A glove slides under a seat. A hat is set down for a second and becomes a permanent resident. A parcel is placed beside a boot and then forgotten as if the mind has decided the parcel has lived a full enough life already. This is how lost property begins, not with a theft, not with a chase, but with a small moment of tiredness. An umbrella leans against a wall and waits patiently for a hand that never returns. It is a very polite kind of abandonment. The umbrella does not complain. It simply stands there with the posture of someone who has been told to hold the door and is still holding it hours later. And because stations are full of people who have somewhere else to be, someone eventually notices the umbrella in the way you notice a pebble in your shoe. Not because it is important, but because it is in the wrong place. A porter, a guard, a clerk, somebody whose job is mostly to keep the machine moving, picks it up with the mild suspicion reserved for damp fabric. Umbrellas are always damp at the precise moment you don't want them to be. The umbrella is carried to an office that is never in the center of anything. Lost property is always down a corridor, behind a door with paint that has been touched up several times. A door that tries to look uninteresting so the world will not bring it more work. Inside, the first shelf holds a small parade of the ordinary: walking sticks, lunch tins, scarves, an occasional child's shoe that looks lonely without being tragic. This is the gentle absurdity of modern life in its early industrial form. We built machines that could cross the country, and the machine's most consistent product was a pile of forgotten mittens. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the station itself sighing, not from sadness, but from administration. A quiet curiosity hook for you to hold loosely. When a railway expands, so does the shadow world of objects that don't quite belong to anyone. Railways make distance smaller, and in exchange, they make ownership slightly less stable. Your hat can travel further than your attention. Your umbrella can outlast your memory. And your memory, which is truly the worst employee, will clock out early and leave your belongings behind like unpaid overtime. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Honestly, the lost property office will outlast both of us. It will be there, patiently bird feeding the world's forgetfulness, whether you click a button or gently drift away mid-sentence. Still, if you like the idea of a historian murmuring about paperwork until your eyelids get heavy, you can do what people did in the 19th century. Make a small commitment and pretend it wasn't too emotional. The first real step of lost property is not sympathy, it is labeling. Not the romantic kind, no wax seals, no secret codes, just tags, slips, and string. Someone ties a label to the umbrella handle with a short length of twine that has seen too many knots. They write a description that tries to be helpful, but ends up sounding like a bored poet. Black umbrella, brown umbrella, umbrella with bent rib, umbrella with no dignity. Some descriptions are more ambitious: lady's parasol, pale, or walking stick, silver head, which is how you can tell the clerk is briefly trying to enjoy their own existence. In some places, items are recorded in ledgers, because the ledger is the only thing Victorians trusted more than a hat. A ledger is a thick book that says, in its silence, that the universe is countable. Each entry is a line of ink, a date, a station, an item, and sometimes a note about where it was found. The notes are quietly funny in their precision. Left on down platform, found in third-class carriage, under seat, in waiting room, as if the object chose a location for its retirement. And then there are claim tickets, which are little bits of paper pretending to be keys. The system is simple in theory. You lose your item, you report it, you describe it, and if the description matches what they have, you get it back. The system is also simple in the way a lock is simple. It works until someone tries to use it while sleepy, nervous, or lying. People often describe their missing objects as if the objects were nobler than they actually are. A battered coat becomes good condition. A faded shawl becomes blue, elegant. A hat becomes very fine. The lost property clerk learns, gently and without judging, that human beings have a complicated relationship with their possessions, especially right after they misplace them. This is where the office becomes a small theater of identity. Someone arrives with the anxious confidence of a person who deserves to be reunited with their belongings. They describe a suitcase about this big, which is a measurement defined by frustration rather than inches. They say they lost it just now, which means several hours ago. They say it contains valuable papers, which might mean a deed, or might mean a recipe, or might mean a letter that is emotionally inconvenient but still technically paper. The clerk listens with the calm deadpan of someone who has heard 12 versions of, "It was right beside me." Sometimes the claimant has no ticket at all, just hope and an expression that says, "Surely the world will fix this for me." The clerk asks careful questions, because questions are the soft fence that keeps chaos from eating the entire station. What color was it exactly? Was there a mark? Was the handle cracked? Did it have a scent of tobacco, or lavender, or that specific smell of wet dog that umbrellas acquire by simple association with rain? These questions are not dramatic. They are the opposite of dramatic. They are gentle, repetitive, and oddly intimate, like describing a friend you don't know very well. A micro hook tucked quietly into your pillow. Victorian railways accidentally created one of the earliest mass systems for object identification at distance. Before you had online forms and Track My Bag, you had a clerk with ink-stained fingers squinting at handwriting and trying to decide if green looks more like gray. It is essentially the same modern experience of customer support, just with more coal and fewer automated emails that say, "We value your patience." Behind the counter, the lost property shelves become a museum of quiet, unglamorous lives. There are umbrellas of every style, some with carved wooden handles, some with cheap plain grips, some with ribs that have collapsed into a sort of defeated bouquet. There are gloves that look like they belong to nobody because gloves have always been unreliable partners. There are spectacles left in cases, which is the cruelest irony. Someone is trying to find their glasses without their glasses. There are books, sometimes with names written inside, sometimes with the name conspicuously missing as if the book too wants privacy. And because rail travel involves food, there are lunch tins and baskets that carry their own small domestic history. The contents, of course, are never a delightful surprise. Time has done its work. No one is opening a forgotten sandwich with optimism. So the tins become empty evidence, and the smell becomes an argument for why certain items should not be kept indefinitely. Lost property teaches you the passage of time in a very practical way. If you forget your sausage, you will learn something about decay, whether you wanted to or not. As the railway grows busier, the office develops rules, because rules are what you invent when you cannot invent more space. Items are kept for a certain period. Some are sent to centralized depots in larger cities, where warehouses of lost property accumulate like slow snowdrifts. Imagine a room full of umbrellas standing in quiet ranks, like a small army that will never be deployed. Imagine shelves of hats with no heads, which is unsettling in a way that feels almost philosophical. A hat without a head is the purest form of almost. Clerks or custodians inspect items for identifying marks. A tailor's stamp, a laundry mark, initials stitched into a lining, a name inked inside a book. Monograms on handkerchiefs, which are essentially Victorian QR codes if you squint and forgive the lack of scanning. There's a dry humor in this. People are private with their feelings, but very willing to embroider their initials on fabric that they then immediately lose in public. Sometimes newspapers are used. Lists of lost items appear in small print, in columns that share space with ship departures, job notices, and advertisements for tonics with confident names. Lost, one umbrella. Found, one reticule. These notices are like early social media posts, except the comments section is a wall, and the algorithm is a clerk's memory. The world is quieter, but the human impulse is the same. We lose things, we announce it, and we hope the universe will cooperate. And then softly, the system reaches the part it never likes to admit. Not everything goes home. Not every umbrella is reunited with the hand that once carried it. Not every glove finds its twin. Not every suitcase is claimed. Some objects simply settle into the office as if they have chosen it. The staff begins to recognize certain recurring items. The fancy cane nobody comes for, the small rug, the odd little brass thing that might be important to someone but looks like a decorative knob to everyone else. What happens next is storage, and storage is where romance goes to take a nap. Objects are cataloged, stacked, bundled. Umbrellas are tied together, handles dangling like sleepy commas. Clothing is folded and placed in bins, sometimes with a tag that will survive, sometimes with a tag that will fall off and create an identity crisis. Books are piled. Keys are held in drawers, which is both appropriate and mildly ironic. A modern analogy, very soft. Think of the lost property depot as the station's cloud storage. Everything is uploaded, except the upload is a person carrying a hat to a shelf, and the server is a wooden crate. Retrieval is possible, but only if you remember your password, and the password is a clear description of a gray scarf that might be green. And like modern cloud storage, the depot becomes slowly a place where things go when no one knows what else to do with them. There are also auctions, which are the lost property system's polite way of saying, we cannot be your attic forever. Unclaimed items are sold, sometimes in lots, sometimes individually. The auctions are practical, not glamorous. You can imagine a room with folding chairs, men with notebooks, women with careful eyes, and a quiet atmosphere that feels like a market day without the vegetables. People bid on umbrellas, on trunks, on miscellaneous bundles of assorted goods, which is the most honest phrase in commerce. A lot might contain 3 hats, a battered valise, and something that looks like an instrument but might just be a decorative cane with delusions. This part has its own gentle absurdity. Someone buys an umbrella not because it belonged to a mystery person, but because the handle is nice. Someone buys a suitcase not because they want its story, but because they need a suitcase and this one is cheap. Ownership shifts, identity resets. The object begins a new life, and the lost property office, relieved, makes room for new forgetting. Sometimes, though, an object carries a stubborn trace, a name scratched into a metal plate, an address scribbled on paper tucked into a book, a photograph in a wallet that no one has claimed, which is the one detail that threatens to be emotional. So we will treat it gently, like a sleeping cat, and not prod it. The office does not want emotion. It wants resolution, which is not the same thing. It wants the shelf to be clear. It wants the ledger to be closed. It wants, if possible, to be bored again. For the staff, boredom becomes a kind of skill. They learn to be calm in the face of other people's panic. They learn to listen without absorbing. They learn to repeat procedures without taking them personally. There is a quiet professionalism in that. It is the same energy as a librarian stamping a book unmoved, consistent, oddly soothing. Lost property clerks are, in a way, early sleep coaches. They teach you, by example, that the world continues even when you cannot find your scarf. Some stations develop little rituals. Items are checked at the end of each day. Tags are rewritten if they smudge. Damp umbrellas are left to dry because mildew is a ruthless roommate. The office smells like wet cloth and ink and, occasionally, citrus from someone's lunch. The sounds are small. Paper, drawers, the soft clack of a stamp. It is the kind of ambience people now pay to stream on apps, except this one includes actual administrative responsibility. And if you want a small, pointless fact to hold for a moment as a micro-hug, railway companies and municipal authorities sometimes argued about responsibility for lost items because bureaucracy loves an argument at low volume. Who holds it? For how long? Who pays for storage? Who's liable if a claim is wrong? These debates are the true engine of the modern world. Not steam, not steel, just committees quietly deciding where to put a hat. Eventually, of course, the objects that do return are reunited in scenes that are less cinematic than you'd hope. A person arrives, describes an umbrella, and is handed an umbrella. They say thank you, or they don't. They check the handle as if umbrellas can impersonate each other. They leave. Life continues. There is no orchestra, no slow motion. Just a door closing softly behind them and the clerk returning to the ledger, where time is written, ink, and believed. The final afterlife of lost property is not a big ending, but a slow blending back into the world. Unclaimed umbrellas become someone's new umbrella. Unclaimed coats become coats again, worn by strangers, warmed by other shoulders. Books are read by new eyes. Lunch tins carry new lunches, and the office remains because forgetting is renewable. The station will never run out of people who set something down and think briefly that the universe is holding it for them. So if you want a small bedtime oath, you can keep facts in one jar and feelings in another. In the facts jar, put the shelf, the tag, the ledger, the claim ticket, the damp umbrella, the careful handwriting, the quiet auction. In the other jar, put the softer things, how it feels to lose something, how it feels to find it, how oddly comforting it is when the world has a place for your mistakes. Tomorrow you can try one small habit: count your gloves before you leave a train, or pat your pocket for your keys, or simply accept that your mind wanders and sometimes your scarf wanders with it. Tonight you can remove one dramatic certainty. The idea that every story must resolve and let the office exist as it always has a back room with a shelf, a pencil, a string, and the gentle sound of objects waiting without insisting while the station clock turns, and the rain taps, and your breathing slows, and the world keeps doing its calm, repetitive work. You might not expect a single tooth to be louder than a passport, but teeth are very committed to remembering. Paper burns, labels get cut away, names slide off like soap in a hotel sink. A molar, on the other hand, sits there in your skull like a tiny cabinet of records, quietly filing away years with no interest in your plans. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air keep doing that soft, patient thing it does at night. And very gently, where and what time are you listening from? It helps to think of an investigation like this as less of a story and more of a long, polite cue. People imagine detectives in dramatic coats, but a lot of the real work happens under fluorescent lights, with someone wearing a lab coat that has one stubborn ink stain near the pocket and a clipboard that makes a small, comforting sound when it's set down. The language is not poetry, it's checkboxes, weight, height, clothing description. Found with, found near, condition. And in the middle of that administrative tenderness, someone tries to coax the smallest facts out of a body that no longer feels obligated to speak. Forensics, when it behaves, is less about revelation and more about routine. It doesn't shout. It measures. It repeats itself until it can say something with a straight face. A technician looks at clothing and writes down what any sleepy person might notice first. Fabric, seams, the way rain has darkened the cuffs. They note what's missing too, which is oddly hard because you can't photograph absence very convincingly. They describe the burnt areas with the sort of dry care usually reserved for bread. Charred, scorched, partially consumed. They take samples because the world loves samples. A tiny scraping of soot, a strand of hair, a trace of something that might be paraffin, or might be the ghost of a gasoline station receipt, or it might be nothing at all, and yet still gets its own little vial and its own little label. And this is where the mood becomes almost absurdly procedural, because even in a case that refuses to offer a proper name, the paperwork insists on naming everything else. Specimen A, slide 3, envelope 12, photograph roll. Everything gets a place to sit. Everything gets a timestamp. You can almost hear the system whispering, if we organize the objects, perhaps the universe will get embarrassed and organize itself too. Early on, there's that soft moment where someone has to decide what identification means. In a place like Norway, dental records can be a quiet shortcut because teeth are good at being unique without being melodramatic. Fillings, crowns, missing teeth that became missing years ago, not hours ago. The shape of dental work can suggest where a person might have lived, or at least where they once sat in a chair with their mouth open and a polite level of panic. Dentists keep records the way librarians keep books, not because it's glamorous, but because it's necessary, and because chaos is very persuasive if you let it talk. So someone begins with the mouth, not as a symbol, but as a filing cabinet. A chart may be drawn with tiny numbers that look like a math problem no one asked for. Different countries prefer different numbering systems, which is one of those gently irritating realities that makes international cooperation feel like trying to assemble furniture with instructions in 3 languages at once. Still, the enamel doesn't care about paperwork systems. Enamel stays enamel. It holds rare patterns like slow handwriting. It tells you about diet and habits, and sometimes even about geography, not because it wants to, but because it can't help leaving clues in its own structure. If you want a small, boring, but strange fact to drift on, dental work can sometimes hint very roughly at materials and styles common to certain regions and decades. Not in a way that points to a single town like a neon sign, but in a way that suggests a coastline rather than a street address. It's like hearing an accent on a phone call and thinking, somewhere near the sea, not apartment 4B, 2nd floor, next to the plant. And then there are the chemicals, which arrive with their own quiet personality. Phenobarbital is one of those names that sounds like a stern librarian. It sits on the tongue with a heavy, careful syllable. Barbiturates were widely used in the mid-20th century for sleep and sedation, and they have that slightly old-fashioned doctor's bag vibe medicine from a time when labels were instructive and side effects were sometimes treated like a surprise party. A lab might test for their presence the way a person checks for keys in a pocket, not with excitement, but with resignation, because if something is there, it will demand more forms. Testing itself is calm in the way a kitchen can be calm. You measure. You mix. You write down what you did so you can do it again exactly, because science is basically repetition dressed up as confidence. Samples are prepared. Instruments hum. Chromatography separates substances like a patient teacher separating children into neat lines. Someone watches peaks appear on paper or on a screen, little hills of information that are impressive mainly because they are consistent. If you stay awake long enough to watch a peak form, you deserve a nap as a prize. Luckily, you don't have to. Soot in the lungs becomes another detail people talk about carefully because even the word soot sounds like a soft blanket, but isn't. Soot suggests smoke. Smoke suggests breathing while fire is active, and yet even that can be irritatingly complicated because bodies are not designed to answer questions politely. They don't give crisp yes or no replies. They give maybe, it depends, and the sample was degraded. Forensics is not a magic trick. It's a slow negotiation with uncertainty. Clothing gets examined too, because fabric is honest in a way people are not. Fabric collects traces without meaning to. Paraffin residue can cling to fibers. Ash can settle into seams. Buttons and zippers hold onto tiny particles like gossip. Some items may have labels removed, which is a strangely intimate sabotage. Cutting a label isn't great drama. It's the kind of action you do with scissors in a quiet room. Snip, fold, snip again. It's almost domestic, and yet it changes the way the world can reattach an object to a life. It is like deleting the name on a school notebook and hoping the notebook will forget who carried it. Witness statements, in contrast, are not samples. They're weather. Someone recalls an accent, not because they are confident, but because the sound lingered. The accent, if it existed, is described with the cautious language of memory. Foreign, German sounding, maybe. It's always maybe. Memory is a very soft instrument, and at night it gets softer. People remember impressions. A woman who seemed composed, someone who asked for a quiet room, someone who preferred corner tables, as if the shape of a meal could tell you something they may want. Hotels become part of the forensic landscape in a surprisingly administrative way. Hotel cards, register entries, breakfast receipts. A clerk remembers a face partly because the face paid in cash, and cash is memorable in a world that expects routine. The act of paying in cash is not a crime. It's just a little old-fashioned, like wearing a hat, but it stands out. The person behind the desk notices it, files it under odd, and years later, that small oddness becomes a breadcrumb. If you're still awake and you feel like subscribing, you can. But honestly, don't strain yourself. This case has been waiting for decades, and it will not mind if you take a nap midway through a sentence about dental enamel. The mountains will stay put. The station clock will keep turning with its steady, tired authority, and the paperwork will remain exactly as patient as it has always been. There's a particular kind of calm that settles over a forensic lab when the work becomes repetitive. Gloves are put on and taken off. Notes are written in the same handwriting, day after day. A person learns to hold a fragment of evidence without treating it like a talisman. They learn not to imagine too much. They learn that imagination is a luxury item, and the job is more like accounting. You count what you have. You note what you don't. You store it properly. You return to it later when there's light, when there's time, when the instruments are ready to hum again. And yet, for all the repetition, small details continue to arrive like quiet visitors. A prescription vial scraped clean. A spoon of German makes sitting in a suitcase like a pointless clue. A pair of sunglasses mentioned by a shop clerk, because the day was cloudy and sunglasses on a cloudy day are the kind of unnecessary decision people remember. A scarf bought shortly before a trip, because scarves are both practical and, somehow, always chosen with more personality than they deserve. At some point, the investigation drifts from the body outward, because the body has given what it can, and the world around it starts to look like a map made of small transactions. This is where the case turns into what it always was, movement. Not a chase, nothing that exciting, but movement in the form of ferries, taxis, hotel rooms, and receipts that say, yes, a person was here, and yes, they bought something, and no, we don't know why. A micro hook for this quieter part. Ordinary travel infrastructure is often the best witness. A train timetable doesn't lie. A ferry schedule doesn't have motives. A hotel registry has the emotional range of a brick. And yet all of these things can hold a life for a moment, like a handrail holds a hand without knowing whose hand it is. You can picture someone arriving in a city in fair weather clothes, then leaving in weather that turns stubborn, as weather does near the sea. Norway in November is not interested in being accommodating. The air cools. The rain arrives with that thin persistence that penetrates wool. People buy small practical items. They adjust their collars. They look for indoor spaces and quiet corners. A person can move through this landscape with very little drama. Just footsteps, ticket counters, and the soft friction of paper money being counted. And then the suitcase enters again, not as a symbol, but as an object with a zipper and a weight. Left luggage is one of the most mundane inventions in modern life. A place where you temporarily stop being responsible for your own belongings. A station provides lockers or a left luggage office, and for a fee you buy a small pocket of amnesty. Your suitcase sits in a row with other suitcases, all of them pretending not to have private lives. Keys are issued. Tickets are stamped. Hours pass. Someone somewhere forgets to come back for what they stored, which is how the station becomes a caretaker for lives that are temporarily off duty. When that happens, the suitcase becomes evidence not because it wants to, but because time makes it so. Someone opens it under fluorescent light. They inventory it the way you inventory a closet, carefully, a little bored, and slightly surprised by what people carry: wigs, clothes, with labels cut away, cosmetics, a notebook that looks ordinary until it doesn't, a small arrangement of objects that suggests planning or at least habit. A person who travels this way does not travel by accident. Even the choice of what to remove, labels, tags, identifiers, requires a calm moment with scissors. It's the quietest form of intention. The notebook is especially irritating because notebooks always look like they should explain something. They have that confessional shape. You want them to open like a diary and spill feelings. But in many cases, notebooks are just notebooks. They contain lists. They contain numbers. They contain little grids that might be codes, or might simply be the kind of personal shorthand any organized person uses to make sense of travel, dates, places, pairs of numbers that could be measurements, or times, or nothing at all. It's the same modern experience of opening someone's notes and realizing, with mild disappointment, that their brain has its own private filing system and you are not invited to understand it. So investigators try what investigators always try. They match. They line up departures and arrivals. They compare ferry tickets to hotel stays. They look at receipts and ask whether the dates correspond to the geography. They build a timeline, which is a kind of bedtime craft project. You take small paper pieces and arrange them into a line, and you tell yourself it means something. A taxi driver remembers a passenger with 2 cases. Not because 2 cases are illegal, but because they're awkward. You remember awkward things. Shops remember customers who buy slightly strange combinations, a scarf and nothing else, or sunglasses on a cloudy day, or cosmetics that seem chosen for anonymity rather than beauty. The case file closes for the night because offices close and people go home, and even mysteries have to respect business hours. But the questions do not close. They sit there. They wait. They become old. They become the kind of problem that can survive on very little food because speculation feeds itself. And then come the theories, which are the soft-footed animals of human thought. They pad into the room quietly and sit down as if they've always lived there. Espionage is the loud guess because it is a tidy story shape. Nearby missile tests, shadowy ports, coded notebooks, burned labels, cash payments. It all fits in the way a blanket fits, comforting because it covers the mess. Smuggling is the quieter theory, because smuggling lives in the boring parts of the world ferries, compartments, small parcels, meetings that look like chance. And then there are personal theories, the idea that someone tried to end the past, tried to become untraceable, tried to cut away identity the way they cut away clothing labels. Each theory holds for a moment, then it loosens, because proof is heavy and most theories are made of light fabric. The evidence is enough to suggest, not enough to declare. And that, oddly, is one of the most historically common outcomes. Many lives pass through bureaucratic systems and leave behind only partial shadows. A person can be witnessed, recorded, and still remain unknown. It's unnerving in daylight and strangely calming at night because it reminds you that the world is too big for certainty to be a requirement. For the sake of sleep, we can stay with the quiet, unglamorous truths. A woman moved through Norway and beyond, sleeping in hotels under different names. She paid in cash. She asked for quiet rooms. She left little fragments behind, receipts, register entries, perhaps the impression of an accent, perhaps the memory of dark perfume. Then she did not return from a valley. A suitcase waited at a station like a closed mouth. Inside it, an identity had been carefully trimmed away, the way you trim loose threads from a coat when you're trying to look neat. If you want a final bedtime oath, you can keep facts in one jar and stories in another. In the facts jar, put the valet, the suitcase, the labels cut clean, the dental work, the lab instruments, the notebooks meet grid, the station clock that keeps turning. In the stories jar, keep everything that wants to rush in and explain. Keep it labeled. Keep it light. Keep it open rarely. Add one small check tomorrow, something practical, like making sure you still have your keys before you leave a room. Remove one dramatic certainty tonight, that idea that every question owes you an answer on schedule. If a new detail arrives, let it touch only what it matches. Let the rest keep sleeping. The valley cools. The station clock turns. The file waits patient and unromantic with its labels burned and its pages quietly settled while the night continues to do what it does best. Soften edges, lower the volume, and let everything unresolved sit down for a while without needing to prove anything at all. You wouldn't have think that cutting the labels out of a few dresses could make a person harder to recognize, but it turns out labels are little witnesses. They're the tiny, obedient storytellers of modern life. They say where something was made, who sold it, and sometimes quietly, how much money was spent to look ordinary. And when those labels are gone, snipped out with patient scissors, the clothes become a little more anonymous. Like they're trying to sleep through the questioning. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air keep its soft, neutral temperature. Let any distant sounds become less interesting by the minute, and very gently, where and what time are you listening from? This is one of those cases that people describe with dramatic words, because humans love drama the way moths love porch lights. But the truth is much calmer. The Isdal woman is mostly a chain of small observations. A jogger on a path, a suitcase left at a station, a few hotel rooms with curtains drawn, and a notebook that refuses to behave like a diary. It's not a chase scene, it's a file. A file that keeps collecting paper until paper becomes its own kind of quiet weather. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or don't. I'll never know. The case certainly won't know. The case has been waiting so long, it has probably developed the patience of a mountain, which, as you may have noticed, is an impressive level of emotional restraint. So we can begin where the world begins noticing anything at all, outside. The Isdal Valley near Bergen isn't a place that tries to impress you with a single, obvious feature. It just sits there. Rock and heather, narrow air, a kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, just undecorated. The ground can hold on to a smell like a secret smoke, damp moss, a metallic note from cold stone. You can imagine someone walking there and not leaving much behind, because the landscape is already busy being itself. Even footprints feel like a temporary suggestion. A jogger stops, not in a heroic way, just in the way people stop when something doesn't fit the background. The human eye is trained to accept trees, grass, and rocks as normal. It's less trained to accept a body that has burned past the point of easy recognition. A watch that has stopped and rings left with a kind of deliberate stillness that makes even a tired mind wonder, briefly, about intention. But the wondering does not solve anything. It just adds a little pressure to the paperwork that follows. Police mark the slope with string because string is one of civilization's gentlest tools. It doesn't arrest anyone. It doesn't accuse anyone. It just says, this area is now important. The valley continues to be a valley anyway. Wind doesn't pause for investigations. Rain doesn't consult the schedule. And that's one of the quietly frustrating things. Nature keeps doing what it does, while humans try to freeze moments with tape lines and numbered evidence tags that flutter like small flags of optimism. The objects at the scene become their own sleepy inventory. Things that should be intimate become procedural. Shoes, maybe boots, softened by weather and time. Small items that have the dull look of being handled carefully by gloved hands. People write descriptions that sound almost boring because they have to be boring. Ring, metal, size unknown. watch face damaged, clothing fragments. It's like describing the contents of a drawer you didn't want to open. And then the investigation does what it always does when the outdoor world refuses to explain itself. It turns toward indoor structures. Because indoors, at least, there are counters and keys and timestamps. Indoors, things get logged. Indoors, human systems pretend they can make chaos sit down politely. A key leads to Bergen Station and to a left luggage area that is the opposite of romantic. It's storage. It's waiting. A suitcase sits there like a closed mouth, holding its breath and refusing to give a simple confession. And when it's opened, the contents are oddly curated. Wigs, clothes with every maker's label cut out. Each little tag removed like a tiny tongue silenced mid-sentence. Cosmetics that could belong to anyone, which is sort of the point. A prescription vial scraped clean, as if even residue has been asked to keep quiet. And then there are the spoons German make, noted with the kind of bland curiosity usually reserved for supermarket brands. There is a gentle absurdity here. Spoons are among the least suspicious objects a human can own. And yet, when you don't have a name, everything becomes suspicious by default. A spoon becomes a clue simply because it exists. It's like losing your phone and suddenly considering every couch cushion a potential criminal mastermind. Under fluorescent light, zippers have a very specific personality. They look like teeth that are trying to seem helpful. Someone catalogs the suitcase carefully, item by item, as if building a small museum exhibit titled Things That Refuse to Explain Themselves. And in the middle of the inventory sits a notebook, ordinary in shape, ordinary in size, until you realize it doesn't behave like ordinary writing. Not a diary. Not a love letter. Not even a board shopping list. More like a ledger of movement. Dates, places, numbers in tidy pairs, as if travel itself has been reduced into a quiet code that wants to remain seated. The suitcase is not a villain. It's a container, but containers have a way of making humans imagine. And imagination, at that time, is best kept on a short leash. So we keep it simple. A suitcase waited. The labels were cut. The vial was clean. The notebook was neat. The station clock did what station clocks do. It turned, it clicked, and it stayed loyal to time in a way humans rarely manage. From there, the story, if we must call it that, drifts into names and rooms. And this part is almost comforting because hotel life is a predictable rhythm. Check in, ask for a room, receive a key, sleep, leave. It's a cycle designed for forgetfulness. Hotels are built to let you be no one for a night, which is charming if you're on vacation and slightly unsettling if you're trying to reconstruct someone from their absence. The Isdal woman seems to have left a stack of hotel records, like breadcrumbs made of bureaucracy. 9 aliases, 12 beds, cards and registers across Norway and beyond. Each signature slightly different, because humans cannot sign their name twice in exactly the same way, and also because someone using an alias has to perform normality with a careful hand. An alias is a costume you wear on paper. You try not to let it slip. Clerks remember certain habits because clerks are professional observers of small human oddities. She arrives alone. She asks for a quiet room. That detail alone is almost sweet because it implies a desire for silence in a world full of doors and voices and clinking breakfast plates. She pays cash. Again, not illegal, simply noticeable. Like someone insisting on using exact change in a self-checkout line. She prefers corner tables she can watch from, which makes her sound like a spy in films, but also like any introvert who wants to avoid being bumped by a stranger's backpack. And the little details multiply as they do. She asks about views. She chooses seats that keep her back protected. She brings wigs and changes her appearance in ways that are both dramatic and intensely practical. Wigs, historically, have always lived in the awkward space between fashion and disguise. They can be a stage prop, a vanity project, a necessity, or a small act of secrecy. In this case, they become part of an inventory list, which is not how wigs dream of being remembered. When she leaves, bins hold little. Mirrors hold nothing at all. That line is almost too poetic for a hotel hallway, but it's also painfully accurate. A hotel room can swallow a person's presence so quickly, it's designed to. Fresh sheets and silent carpeting are basically professional erasers. Then there's the notebook again, sitting at the edge of all this. The small grid of numbers, the dates and places. Investigators try to do what any tired person would do with a puzzle. They match things. Departures against arrivals. Ferry routes against receipts. Hotel stays against train timetables. It becomes a kind of administrative knitting. You take strands that exist, paper-proof, ticket stubs, memory fragments, and you try to weave them into something that resembles a route. And the route whispers without explaining. It says she was here, and then she was there. It rarely says why. It never says who. There is a calm cruelty in travel documentation. It records movement with great confidence, and it records meaning with none. If you want a small microhook to hold gently for a moment, here it is. In many investigations, the most reliable witnesses are not people. They are systems, train schedules, hotel ledgers, station lockers. They have no motive. They are dull. They are also annoyingly consistent. A human might forget a face, but a receipt remembers the date with the cold loyalty of printed ink. And now, because the case is uncooperative, it shifts into the lab. This is where the atmosphere changes from rain and heather to disinfectant and quiet humming machines. Forensics is not cinematic. It's closer to cooking, if cooking involved far more gloves and far fewer compliments. You measure, you label, you repeat. You try to make uncertainty behave. Teeth become important, which is not the glamorous roll teeth imagined for themselves. Dental work can suggest clinics south of the North Sea. Enamel can hint at childhood far from fjords, because enamel, like a very boring historian, records what it was built from and where. Some modern techniques can examine isotopes in teeth and bones to suggest regions of origin in broad strokes, like pointing to a distant part of the map rather than a specific street. It's the kind of answer that feels precise in science and vague in human terms. Not from here, said politely with numbers. Phenobarbital appears in the discussion, that heavy, old-fashioned name that sounds like it belongs to a Stern Library catalog. Barbiturates were widely used for sleep and sedation in earlier decades, and their presence raises questions, but questions are easy. The hard part is the answers. Was it prescribed? Was it self-administered? Was it part of a pattern? The lab offers measurements, not motives, concentrations, traces, the smallest chemical signatures treated with respect, usually reserved for official stamps. Soot in the lungs is noted because soot tells you about smoke and breathing and timing, but even soot has a habit of refusing to be a perfect narrator. Bodies are complicated. Fires are complicated. Weather is complicated. The lab findings become another stack of careful sentences that mean, essentially, something happened, and it happened in this general way, which is both helpful and deeply unsatisfying. Clothing is examined again, now as fabric rather than as fashion. Traces of paraffin suggest accelerants. Fibers hold on to tiny particles like gossip in a scene. Fingertips, if they can be read at all, become a kind of reluctant fingerprint of identity. Except this case has always struggled with identity, as if identity is the one guest who refused to sign the register. Witnesses mention a foreign accent that shifted slightly with each city, which is either an intentional performance or the normal way accents behave when people are multilingual and tired. Accents aren't fixed objects, they're living habits. In an ordinary life, an accent drifting is charming. In a case file, it becomes suspicious because everything becomes suspicious when you're missing the comforting anchor of a name. And so, after all the measurements, the case remains what it was, incomplete. Forensics can tell you about the edges of a life. It can tell you about materials and traces and patterns. It cannot tell you what a person hoped for when they checked into a quiet room, paid in cash, and asked about the view. So the mind, being the mind, begins to tiptoe into theories. Theories are soft-footed. They walk quietly so you don't notice when they enter the room. Espionage is the loud guess because it's neat. It has a shape. It explains wigs, aliases, burned labels, careful movements, coded notebooks. It even comes with nearby missile tests, which sound dramatic purely because the words missile tests are inherently louder than hotel breakfast. Smuggling is the quieter theory because smuggling lives in ordinary infrastructure, ferries, ports, valuables that travel well, meetings that happen in corners with cash. Smuggling doesn't need trench coats. It just needs routes, timing, and people willing to treat a suitcase like a normal suitcase while it isn't. Then there are private explanations, the ones that don't sparkle. A personal flight from a past, a desire to end a name, a complicated knot of marriage, debt, fear, or simply a wish to be untraceable in a world that keeps telling you to fill out forms. These explanations are less exciting, which is oddly more believable because most human lives are not spy thrillers. They are paperwork and habits and small quiet decisions made at train stations. Each theory holds for a page and then loosens at the spine. Because proof is heavy, and this case has always been full of light things. Impressions, fragments, cut labels, clean vials, tidy numbers. People want a single answer the way they want a single key that opens every door. But history often hands you a ring of keys, none of them labeled, and tells you to try them slowly, without clanking. And at bedtime, that's all right. Unfinished cases have a strange softness to them. They remind you that the world is larger than certainty, and that some questions are allowed to sit unanswered without the ceiling collapsing. The file closes for the night because offices do that. The station clock turns, the valley cools. The paper rests, so here is a gentle bedtime oath if you want one. Keep facts in one dry valley, suitcase, aliases, notebook, teeth, traces. Keep stories in another espionage, smuggling, private flight, all the dramatic shapes the mind likes to try on. Label the story jar lightly, open it rarely. Add one small check tomorrow, something practical, like making sure you know where you left your own keys. Remove one dramatic certainty tonight, the belief that every mystery owes you a tidy ending before you fall asleep. If a new detail arrives, let it touch only what it matches. Let the rest keep sleeping. The valley keeps its quiet. The station keeps its clockwork patience. The case waits with its labels burned clean, and the night continues doing what it does best, softening edges, lowering volume, and letting even the most stubborn questions sit down in the dark without needing to prove anything at all. You might not expect a coil of rope to require paperwork, witnesses, and a small vocabulary of polite disappointment, but it does. Rope is one of those objects that pretends to be simple. It sits there, quiet and obedient, like a sleeping cat stretched across a warm stone. And yet, in the great shipyards of early modern Europe, rope was treated less like string and more like destiny measured weight, tarred, tagged, and counted as if each twist could decide whether a ship returned with spice news or nothing at all. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the quiet do its job. Let your shoulders sink a little, as if they've been carrying a small sack of unnecessary thoughts and are now allowed to set it down. And very softly, where and what time are you listening from? We're going to drift to Venice, not the postcard Venice with violins and bright daytime footsteps, but the working Venice where the air smells faintly of salt and pitch, and the water keeps tapping the stone like a clerk impatiently waiting for a stamp. We're heading toward the arsenal, the shipyard complex that functioned like a city within a city, with gates, guards, rules, and routines that were on paper beautifully orderly. The arsenal's fame usually arrives with loud words like power and navy and empire, but the quieter truth is more soothing. Its strength also depended on predictable supplies, disciplined storage, and men in plain rooms who knew how to write received without making it sound emotional. Imagine walking through a wide gate in the early hours when the sky isn't quite convinced it wants to become morning. A lantern doesn't so much light the way as politely suggest it. The stones are damp. The air tastes like brine and cold metal. Somewhere, chains settle with a mild clank, the way a house settles when everyone is asleep. A guard notices you, then decides you are not worth the effort of curiosity, which is a small blessing in any bureaucracy. Inside, the arsenal is mostly shapes and repetition, long sheds, stacked timber, hooks on beams, tools arranged the way tools like to be arranged close enough to feel useful, far enough to avoid blame. You can almost hear the difference between an empty warehouse and a warehouse full of expectations. And rope, especially, has expectations. Rope wants to be dry. Rope wants to be coiled correctly. Rope wants to be kept away from rats, damp, and the kind of casual knife work that turns valuable cordage into miscellaneous offcuts, a phrase that makes accountants sigh in any century. Somewhere in this complex is a rope walk, or at least a space dedicated to making rope properly long, straight, and boring in a way that only truly important things are boring. Rope doesn't like corners. Rope making prefers distance. Fibers are drawn out, twisted, laid, and twisted again like a slow dance where everyone knows the steps and nobody applauds. Hemp fibers, often imported and bundled, look unimpressive at first, pale, fibrous, slightly dusty until they are transformed into something that can hold a mass steady while wind tries very hard to argue. Here's a small, gentle absurdity. Rope is graded. Not emotionally, of course, but administratively. Thickness is measured. Length is measured. Sometimes weight is noted. There are words for ropes, rolls, cables, hawsers, lines, each with its own personality and its own place in a ship's body. And in a place like Venice, where shipping is not a hobby but a habit, someone had to decide which rope belonged where, and how much where the state could afford this month. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about tags and seals, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. The rope will not be offended. Rope is famously indifferent to audience engagement. Now let's get close to the moment everyone quietly hates and quietly respects. Inspection. Finished rope is not simply accepted because it exists. It's examined like bread at a market stall. A foreman runs hands along it, not romantically, but with the practical touch of someone checking for uneven twist, weak spots, or fibers that look like they didn't commit fully to the assignment. The rope is bent slightly because bending reveals honesty. A serious fray is a confession. A rough irregularity is a warning. And a perfectly even line is, in its own way, a kind of silent prayer answered. Then comes the tar or pitch, or whatever protective treatment is used to help rope survive seawater's constant, gentle violence. Tar is a smell you remember. It clings to hands, to clothes, to the idea of work itself. It makes rope darker and slightly heavier, like it has put on a coat and is now ready to go outside. Treated rope is less pretty, but sea-proofing has never been about beauty. It's about refusing to rot politely. This is where the calm comedy of logistics begins. Storage. Rope must be coiled. Not loosely, not with casual loops that tangle the next time someone tries to be efficient. Coils are made with a rhythm around and around, like the mind circling the same quiet thought before sleep. Large coils are laid in designated areas, sometimes on racks or hooks, sometimes in bins, sometimes in places the records describe with words that sound more confident than the real world ever is. Bay 3, Shed 7, near the east wall. Humans love pretending walls are more cooperative than they are. And then, because this is Venice, And because Venice worshipped paperwork as a civic sport cordage becomes a written object. A note is made, a mark is placed, a tag is tied. In some places and periods, goods were sealed with lead seals or marked with stamps to indicate origin, inspection, or ownership. Even if a rope looks like a rope, the state prefers to see it as a line item. The ledger is the true shipyard. The wood and rope are merely its proof. A scribe sits at a desk that has seen 1,000 elbows lean on it with mild impatience. Wax strips on parchment sometimes, not as drama, but as the natural side effect of trying to work before sunrise. He writes the date, he writes a category, he writes a number. He writes a note like received from supplier or issued to galley, phrases that make human effort sound as calm and bloodless as a weather report. He does not write, "This rope might save men from drowning." That would be too interesting and also too hard to prove. The documents themselves have their own sleepy beauty. A receipt is a small story where nothing happens. A requisition is a request where everyone already knows the answer. Yes, we need rope. Because ships are basically floating arguments with gravity, and rope is how you keep the argument from winning. An inventory is a list with ambitions. It wants to imply control. It wants to suggest that reality is countable. And so you can imagine, deep in the arsenal, a routine that repeats until it becomes a lullaby. Rope arrives. Rope is inspected. Rope is treated. Rope is coiled. Rope is tagged. Rope is recorded. Then rope leaves, like a polite guest who signs the book and closes the door without slamming it. Now, because the arsenal is not only a place of making, but also a place of accountability, we drift into the quieter rooms, the ones that rarely appear in paintings. These rooms hold the real power of any state, the ability to remember what it owns. A ledger is a memory device with a spine. It stores the past in neat rows, so the future can pretend it is planned. In these rooms, the language changes. Instead of tar and hemp, you hear issued, returned, short, and damaged. There is a particular satisfaction in the word returned because it means something came back. It suggests the world is not entirely a one-way flow of loss. But returned also arrives with conditions. Returned rope might be frayed. Returned rope might be shorter. Returned rope might be unfit. A polite term for this will embarrass us if we try to rely on it again. This is where the audits live. Audits are not loud. They are the opposite of loud. They are the soft footsteps of suspicion in a quiet hallway. Someone compares the ledger to the storehouse. Someone counts coils. Someone writes down a number and then writes down another number and then quietly notices they do not match. This is the moment where history becomes extremely human in a boring way, not through wars, but through arithmetic. If a coil is missing, the options are simple and endlessly annoying. It was issued and not recorded. It was recorded and not issued. It was stolen in a way that required confidence and perhaps a cloak. It was moved to a different shed by someone who believed geography could override bureaucracy, which is a common belief among busy people. Or it was ruined by damp, because damp is the most dedicated saboteur in maritime history. Damp doesn't need a motive. Damp simply arrives and works over time. The scribe confronted with discrepancy does what scribes do. He creates more paperwork, a note in the margin, a mark beside a line, a small symbol that means check this, which is the historical equivalent of putting a sticky note on your forehead and hoping it stays there. A supervisor is informed. A supervisor frowns. The frown is recorded nowhere, but the consequences might be. Here's another tiny, sleepy oddity. States often trusted paper more than they trusted people, but paper is written by people, and people are famously tired. A tired clerk can misread a number. A tired inspector can sign off too quickly. A tired storekeeper can forget whether he moved a coil to avoid the drip in the corner. And suddenly, a featureless object rope, becomes the center of a small administrative storm that never makes it into epic poetry, but absolutely shapes how calmly a ship can be fitted out for a voyage. And because Venice ran on committees the way some modern offices run on meetings, there might be a chain of responsibility so long it could be, well, rope-like. One office orders, another confirms, another receives, another stores, another issues, another asks why it was issued. And the rope, meanwhile, simply waits to be used, quietly wondering why humans need so many stages to agree that a loop is, in fact, a loop. As dawn brightens, the arsenal becomes more awake. Workers arrive, tools are lifted, wood is shifted. A hammer knocks in the distance with the steady patience of a clock. But the paperwork continues, because paperwork is the one worker that never calls in sick. A requisition might come in for a specific Ship 1 galley, 2 merchant vessels, a repair job for a boat that had an argument with a dock. The request might specify thickness. The request might be urgent, but it will still be written politely, because urgency looks unprofessional on official paper. In moments like these, you can almost see the invisible map of a ship drawn over the warehouse. Coils designated for anchor cable. Coils designated for rigging. Coils designated for things nobody thinks about until they fail lashings. Spare limes, the humble cords that hold small items in place while the sea tries to reorganize everything. Now we drift into the last quiet part of our night. What happens after the rope has been counted, issued, and forgotten? Because rope is rarely celebrated. Even sailors, who rely on it constantly, tend to treat it like air noticed, mostly when it isn't there, or when it betrays you by snapping at the worst possible moment. But the arsenal did understand, in its calm way, that neglected rope is a sketchy foundation for national confidence. So there are routines for maintenance. Old rope might be inspected and cut down into smaller lines. Frayed ends might be whipped, bound tightly so they don't unravel, like giving the rope a tidy bedtime braid. Some worn rope might be relegated to less critical tasks, because even in the 16th or 17th century, people understood a basic principle: do not assign your weakest materials to your most dangerous jobs. This principle is also useful for modern life if you consider weak materials to include your attention span at 2 a.m. There may be notes about tar supplies too, because tar is its own inventory problem. It's sticky, it's heavy, it goes everywhere, it smells like permanence. Storing tar is like storing a mood. It leaks into the environment no matter how organized you are. And yet it must be kept, because untreated rope becomes a short-term relationship with the sea, and the sea is not known for honoring short-term promises. In the quiet ledger rooms, the day's entries accumulate. Ink dries, sand may be sprinkled to prevent smudging. Pages turn with the soft sound of decisions being finalized. And at some point, someone closes the book. The closure is not dramatic. It's simply the end of a shift, the end of the light, the end of pretending you can hold the whole arsenal in your head at once. Outside, Venice continues. Water continues. The city listens to itself breathing. Somewhere, a ship sits in partial skeleton form, waiting for its rigging like a person waiting for a coat on a cold morning. Rope will go to it soon. Rope will be pulled, knotted, tested, and made to do what rope does: hold tension without complaining. And then, inevitably, rope disappears into normality. A line vanishes over a railing, a cable tightens, a coil is cut into lengths, a knot is tied, and nobody writes down the knot, because nobody has time for that kind of intimacy with detail, except us right now, in this soft little pocket of night. So let's end the way the arsenal would approve of, with a calm, practical oath that doesn't try to solve anything, because solving is loud. Keep facts in one jar: hemp, tar, coils, tax, ledgers, inspections, the quiet arithmetic of supply. Keep feelings in another jar, smaller, and store it somewhere safe, because the story tonight is not about drama. It is about the soothing reality that great powers were often held together by ordinary people doing ordinary counting. If you want to change one small thing tomorrow, let it be something boring and kind. Label a cable, fold a shirt, put your keys in the same place twice. Let order be a gentle habit rather than a strict religion. And now, let the rope rest in its coil. Let the ledger sit closed. Let the water tap the stone without needing an answer. The arsenal sleeps, the ink finishes drying, and the night keeps going quietly, patiently like a long line paying out into dark, steady water. You might not expect a hiking valley to become famous mostly for its administrative problems, but history has a special affection for paperwork that gets left behind. A quiet place can stay quiet for centuries, and then very suddenly and very unhelpfully become the site of something. Not a monument, not a battle, just a small, stubborn mystery that refuses to sit properly in any file cabinet. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the light be low. Let the air do that soft, boring thing where it simply exists. And very gently, where and what time are you listening from? We're going to Norway, to a valley near Bergen with a name that sounds like a breath taken through cold air. Isdal, the Ice Valley, though in practice it's often more damp than dramatic, and the kind of place where moss is most of the decorating. It's not the sort of landscape that tries to impress you. It just sits there, dark with trees, patient with stone, letting fog do the slow work of making distances feel longer. A valley like this has its own rhythm. Water drips, birds argue quietly, wind rearranges the same small collection of leaves. It is, in other words, ideal for sleep. It is also the kind of place where a passing jogger can notice something unusual simply because everything else is so committed to being ordinary. In late autumn or early winter, depending on the year and the mood of the calendar, the air has that metallic taste that cold weather brings, like a spoon left outside overnight. Heather and low brush hold onto tiny beads of water. The path is not glamorous. It is the kind of path that sees practical shoes and people who think fresh air is a moral virtue. And then one day, a person is found there, an unidentified woman, later nicknamed the Isdal woman, and the valley is forced into a role it never auditioned for. The detail that often gets mentioned first is that she was burned, because modern minds like dramatic headlines, but we're not going to hurry. We're going to move more slowly than that, because in real investigations, as in real life, everything actually begins with noticing. Noticing is a gentle act, a figure that doesn't match the landscape, a smell that doesn't belong, a stillness that feels too deliberate. Then comes the soft, procedural next step. Someone tells someone, and then, sooner or later, the quiet is divided up with string, because nothing says serious official attention, like a line of cord making the forest look briefly like a badly organized parcel. There's an odd tenderness in how authorities mark a place. It's not emotional tenderness, it's logistical tenderness. You don't want to lose track of where something was, because roughly over there is not a strong foundation for a report. So they mark, they measure, they photograph. They look at the ground as if it might produce an explanation, the way soil produces mushrooms. They collect small items because small items have a habit of being louder than big ones. A watch that stopped. Bits of clothing. Objects that shouldn't be there and therefore must mean something. And while the nature of the discovery is grim, the process that follows is strangely very calm. It is forms and protocols and people trying to keep their handwriting steady. This is where the valley becomes less about tragedy and more about inventory. The human brain, when faced with something it can't comfortably understand, often retreats into listing. Count the things, describe them, place them into categories. Personal effects, clothing, unidentified. In that moment, the world turns into a desk with labeled drawers. And if you've ever tried to label drawers properly, you know how hopeful that is. Now, the valley isn't the only place in this story. Another place enters quietly, like a second character in a very boring play, the train station in Bergen. Not because the station itself is especially romantic, but because stations are where objects arrive without their owners explaining why. And in this case, a suitcase was found left behind, and the suitcase, like so many historical objects, becomes famous for not having the decency to be straightforward. A suitcase is such a modest thing. It's a box with handles. It says, "I contain your socks, your toothpaste, and maybe a regret or two." This suitcase, however, comes preloaded with discomfort for anyone who enjoys simple narratives. Inside were clothes and some items that suggest someone traveled with intention, and the most softly peculiar detail, many labels had been cut out. Clothing labels, maker's tags, anything that might have said, with innocent confidence, "Hello, I am from this shop in this country, and my owner bought me on a Tuesday." Those little scraps of identity are removed neatly, like someone tidying up the evidence of having ever been in a changing room. There is something almost domestic about it. Scissors, thread ends, the patient work of snipping. It's not loud. It's not dramatic, it's just persistent. It has the same energy as someone removing tags from pillows because they don't like being told what not to do. Except here it's tied to anonymity rather than household rebellion. Under fluorescent station light, the suitcase becomes a small museum of deliberate blandness. A wig, perhaps, cosmetics, items that look ordinary until you add up how carefully they refuse to point to one specific life. This is a good moment for a tiny modern analogy, very soft, very non-threatening. It is like looking at someone as browser history and finding only the homepage of the weather. Not suspicious in itself, just curated. We can pause here for the smallest, sleepest call to action. If you re still awake after all this discussion of labels and paperwork, you can subscribe, or you can simply continue existing quietly. Both are valid. The valley will continue either way. Now we drift gently into the next layer, names. Names are usually the part of a mystery where people get interested, but for our purposes, names are mainly a filing problem. The Isdal woman is associated with multiple aliases. Reports often mention a string of them across different hotels and locations, with at least 9 names commonly cited in retellings. 9 names is, impressively, a lot of commitment to not committing. It's like having 9 different email accounts just to sign up for newsletters you never read. Hotels in this period are their own small ecosystems of observation. Clerks notice patterns, guests who pay cash, guests who ask for quiet rooms, guests who prefer corner tables not because they're plotting necessarily, but because corners make you feel less exposed, and also because you can see the door without turning your head. If you've ever chosen a seat in a cafe and then pretended you didn't choose it for strategic reasons, you understand the vibe. There are notes and registers. There are signatures that look like someone's handwriting trying to behave. There's the eerie mundanity of it all, the same questions, the same keys, the same polite phrases exchanged at desks polished by routine. And because hotel life is so repetitive, it becomes strangely good at capturing small deviations. A person who arrives alone and leaves alone, a person who changes rooms, a person who asks questions about views or schedules. Nothing illegal about a view, but as with labels, a collection of harmless details can begin to look like a pattern, especially when investigators are desperate for patterns. In these rooms, the language changes. Instead of tar and hemp, you hear issued, returned, short, and damaged. There is a particular satisfaction in the word returned because it means something came back. It suggests the world is not entirely a one-way flow of loss. But return also arrives with conditions. Returned rope might be frayed. Returned rope might be shorter. Returned rope might be unfit, a polite term for this will embarrass us if we try to rely on it again. This is where the audits live. Audits are not loud. They are the opposite of loud. They are the soft footsteps of suspicion in a quiet hallway. Someone compares the ledger to the storehouse. Someone counts coils. Someone writes down a number and then writes down another number and then quietly notices they do not match. This is the moment where history becomes extremely human in a boring way, not through wars, but through arithmetic. If a coil is missing, the options are simple and endlessly annoying. It was issued and not recorded. It was recorded and not issued. It was stolen in a way that required confidence and perhaps a cloak. It was moved to a different shed by someone who believed geography could override bureaucracy, which is a common belief among busy people. Or it was ruined by damp, because damp is the most dedicated saboteur in maritime history. Damp doesn't need a motive. Damp simply arrives and works overtime. The scribe, confronted with discrepancy, does what scribes do. He creates more paperwork. A note in the margin, a mark beside a line, a small symbol that means check this, which is the historical equivalent of putting a sticky note on your forehead and hoping it stays there. A supervisor is informed, a supervisor frowns. The frown is recorded nowhere, but the consequences might be. Here's another tiny, sleepy oddity. States often trusted paper more than they trusted people. But paper is written by people, and people are famously tired. A tired clerk can misread a number. A tired inspector can sign off too quickly. A tired storekeeper can forget whether he moved a coil to avoid the drip in the corner. And suddenly, a featureless object rope becomes the center of a small administrative storm that never makes it into epic poetry, but absolutely shapes how calmly a ship can be fitted out for a voyage. And because Venice ran on committees the way some modern offices run on meetings, there might be a chain of responsibility so long it could be, well, rope-like. One office orders, another confirms, another receives, another stores, another issues, another asks why it was issued, and the rope, meanwhile, simply waits to be used, quietly wondering why humans need so many stages to agree that a loop is, in fact, a loop. As dawn brightens, the arsenal becomes more awake. Workers arrive, tools are lifted, wood is shifted. A hammer knocks in the distance with the steady patience of a clock. But the paperwork continues because paperwork is the one worker that never calls in sick. A requisition might come in for a specific ship 1 galley, 2 merchant vessels, a repair job for a boat that had an argument with a dock. The request might specify thickness. The request might be urgent, but it will still be written politely because urgency looks unprofessional on official paper. In moments like these, you can almost see the invisible map of a ship drawn over the warehouse. Coils designated for anchor cable. Coils designated for rigging. Coils designated for things nobody thinks about until they fail lashings. Spare lines, the humble cords that hold small items in place while the sea tries to reorganize everything. Now we drift into the last quiet part of our night. What happens after the rope has been counted, issued, and forgotten, because rope is rarely celebrated. Even sailors, who rely on it constantly, tend to treat it like air noticed, mostly when it isn't there, or when it betrays you by snapping at the worst possible moment. But the arsenal did understand, in its calm way, that neglected rope is a sketchy foundation for national confidence. So there are routines for maintenance. Old rope might be inspected and cut down into smaller lines. Frayed ends might be whipped, bound tightly so they don't unravel, like giving the rope a tidy bedtime braid. Some worn rope might be relegated to less critical tasks, because even in the 16th or 17th century, people understood a basic principle. Do not assign your weakest materials to your most dangerous jobs. This principle is also useful for modern life. If you consider weak materials to include your attention span at 2 a.m., There may be notes about tar supplies. 2, because tar is its own inventory problem. It's sticky. It's heavy. It goes everywhere. It smells like permanence. Storing tar is like storing a mood. It leaks into the environment no matter how organized you are. And yet it must be kept, because untreated rope becomes a short-term relationship with the sea, and the sea is not known for honoring short-term promises. In the quiet ledger rooms, the day's entries accumulate, ink dries. Sand may be sprinkled to prevent smudging. Pages turn with the soft sound of decisions being finalized, and at some point, someone closes the book. The closure is not dramatic. It's simply the end of a shift. The end of the light. The end of pretending you can hold the whole arsenal in your head at once. Outside, menace continues. Water continues. The city listens to itself breathing. Somewhere, a ship sits in partial skeleton form, waiting for its rigging like a person waiting for a coat on a cold morning. Rope will go to it soon. Rope will be pulled, knotted, tested, and made to do what rope does. Hold tension without complaining. And then, inevitably, rope disappears into normality. A line vanishes over a railing, a cable tightens. A coil is cut into lengths. A knot is tied, and nobody writes down the knot, because nobody has time for that kind of intimacy with detail, except us right now, in this soft little pocket of night. So let's end the way that Arsenal would approve of, with a calm, practical oath that doesn't try to solve anything because solving is loud. Keep facts in one jar: hemp, tar, coils, tags, ledgers, inspections, the quiet arithmetic of supply. Keep feelings in another jar, smaller, and store it somewhere safe, because the story tonight is not about drama. It is about the soothing reality that great powers were often held together by ordinary people doing ordinary counting. If you want to change one small thing tomorrow, let it be something boring and kind. Label a cable, fold a shirt, put your keys in the same place twice. Let order be a gentle habit rather than a strict religion, and now let the rope rest in its coil. Let the ledger sit closed. Let the water tap the stone without needing an answer. The arsenal sleeps, the ink finishes drying, and the night keeps going quietly, patiently, like a long line paying out into dark, steady water. You might not expect an empire of trade to wobble on something as humble as a wooden barrel, but a lot of history lives inside containers. You can keep the answer private, like a coin in a pocket you've stopped checking. If you re still awake by the time we reach the part where someone argues with a measuring stick, you can subscribe. Or don't, it's fine. The herring will not be offended, and the paperwork has never once asked for applause. Now herring. Small, shiny, and socially ambitious. In the early modern Low Countries, herring wasn't only a food. It was routine labor turned into income. It's not glamorous. It's repetitive in the way that sleep is repetitive, which is part of why it works so well as bedtime history. You mend nets, you scrape decks, you haul salt, you sharpen knives, and then, crucially, you prepare the barrel, because the barrel is the part of the fish that survives the journey. This is not an accident. A good barrel is designed for hands that are cold, decks that are wet, and a world that does not politely pause while you adjust your grip. And in places that live by trade, the barrel can't just be good. It has to be recognizably good to strangers. The barrel becomes a unit of trust you can roll across water. So people begin to care about what counts. How big is a barrel supposed to be? How thick are the staves? Where do the hoops sit? How tight is too tight? How loose is suspicious? It's a quiet kind of authority, like a librarian stare, except it's aimed at wood. This is where the boredom gets wonderfully detailed. A cooper's work involves choosing timber, often oak, and respecting grain direction because wood likes to split at the worst possible time, like a fragile shopping bag. The hoop's iron, or sometimes another material, depending on time and place, must be the right size so they bite without crushing. Then the fish arrives, and the fish does what fish does. It tries immediately to become a problem. So the processing has to be quick. Hands move fast with the calm speed of people who have done the same motion thousands of times. Knives are small and practical. Salt is not sprinkled like a chef's flourish. Salt is applied like a policy decision. It's layered, pressed, and trusted to hold back time. In a way, salt is the most patient employee involved because it just sits there doing its job without asking for lunch. And because humans are humans, the moment you establish a standard barrel, someone will try to make a barrel that looks standard while giving away less. Not always out of villainy, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of habit, sometimes because the human brain loves loopholes the way it loves snacks. A stave shaved a little thin, a hoop placed a fraction higher, a barrel belly shaped just slightly differently so it holds a little less than it seems. These are tiny changes, and tiny changes are exactly what systems fear, because tiny changes scale beautifully. So inspection becomes its own craft. An inspector develops a special kind of patience, the patience of seeing the same object all day, and still noticing small differences, like someone who can hear when a refrigerator hum changes pitch. He checks the barrel shape, he checks the hoops, he checks the lid fit. He checks the marks. Marks matter. Not because anyone wants to be poetic, but because distant buyers like to know who to complain to, and complaint is a very old form of connectivity. It's early customer service, except the customer service desk is a dockside table, and the warranty is basically your reputation. A mark is also an invitation for bureaucracy. Once you can mark something, you can list it. Once you can list it, you can count it. This is the quiet staircase from fish to paperwork, and it has very shallow steps. Columns of numbers that must align, or else someone spends an afternoon hunting for a missing difference, the way a person hunts for a missing sock, except the sock is now a financial discrepancy. Barrels become units, full barrels, half barrels, fractions that make sense to accountants and to absolutely nobody else. Someone writes the same number twice. Someone checks it 3 times because 3 feels safer than 2, even when it changes nothing. And when agreements get fuzzy, when witnesses tangle, when reputations collide, when someone insists the barrel was underfilled and someone else insists it was perfectly proper, it's tempting to imagine shouting. But much of trade conflict is not loud. It's quiet escalation, letters, receipts, witness statements, re-inspections, a fine if necessary. The whole system is designed to turn irritation into documents because documents are easier to store than anger. Anger takes up space. Paper stacks neatly. The soft absurdity is that the barrel itself changes over time. Wood absorbs moisture. Barrels swell and tighten in damp holes. A barrel that feels slightly loose in a dry workshop can become satisfyingly snug after a few days near seawater. It's like a container that slowly decides to behave once it has traveled, an almost magical quality, except it's just wood physics doing its wooden thing. But that means inspectors and coopers need to account for a moving target. A barrel is not one fixed object. It is an object that becomes more itself in humidity. Then there's salt again, patiently waiting to become political. Salt was valuable in many places and periods, sometimes taxed, sometimes controlled, always heavy. Salt is the difference between herring as food and herring as commerce. Too little, and the fish becomes a short-term disappointment. Enough and the fish becomes a long-term product that can cross distance and still be, in a practical sense, edible. This is not romance. This is the slow negotiation between biology and bookkeeping, with salt acting as the mediator who never raises its voice. Witnesses are not always about drama. Often they are about routine safety, like having someone watch you count cash, not because you suspect them, but because your own brain sometimes wanders away mid-number and comes back pretending it never left. A witness helps reality stay seated. If a shipment goes wrong, the fault should land on the barrel and the transaction, not on your family, your neighbors, your doors, your peace. So there are practices, clear marks, clear records, official measurements, guild oversight. If you listen carefully, you can hear how this becomes culture. Towns become known for certain qualities. Merchants choose routes based on trust. Guild rules harden into habits. A proper barrel becomes an expectation, then a baseline, then almost an identity. People don't say, "This is fish." They say, "This is fish from there, packed like that, marked like this." The fish is no longer just a fish. It has paperwork attached like a tiny passport made of wood. And far away, in a market, someone opens a barrel and simply wants dinner. The consumer doesn't care about hoop placement. The consumer cares about taste and smell, and whether the house will carry a sea scent for 2 days. Yet that consumer is downstream of all the quiet details. They are eating the result of standards and inspections and ledgers and someone's careful decision about where a stamp should sit. It's the strange intimacy of commerce, strangers coordinating through objects without ever meeting. There are signs that the system works, and they are very unromantic signs. The fish arrives in acceptable condition. The buyer pays without complaint. The seller is invited to do business again. The ledger balances, the barrels stack. The dock keeps moving the next day, as if nothing particularly happened. And that, in a way, is success. Not fireworks, just continuity. A whole economy humming like a fan you stop noticing. And there are signs that the system loosens. A barrel leaks, a lid pops. A shipment spoils faster than expected. A stamp is unclear. A buyer claims the measure was off. Then the system responds the way sleepy systems always respond. It adds a layer. Another rule, another check, another form. Another person whose job is to stare at the same object until their eyes learn to see crookedness. If you've ever watched a modern workplace respond to one small mistake by inventing 3 new meetings, you already know this historical rhythm. It is ancient and evergreen. Now we can let the topic soften at the edges. Because as fascinating as it is that people once worried deeply about the size of a fish barrel, it's also reassuring. It means history is not only battles and speeches, it's also ordinary people trying to make ordinary work predictable, safe, and fair enough to live with. It's cooperage and salt and stamps and gently stressed clerks who want their columns to align so they can go home and stop thinking about barrels. So here is a bedtime oath for boring objects that quietly run the world. Keep facts in one jar: staves, hoops, salt, marks, ledgers, damp holds, inspections, witnesses, routine hands doing routine work. Keep stories in another jar: heroic masterminds, secret plots, dramatic motives. Label the story jar lightly. Open it rarely. Most of the time, the truth is simply that people wanted to sell fish and not be cheated, and they built a soft architecture of standards to make that possible. Let the dock settle in your mind like a place you've walked past 1,000 times. Let the hammer taps fade. Let the ink dry. Let the barrel roll into storage, not dramatic, just inevitable. The sea keeps moving. The paperwork keeps stacking. And somewhere a measuring stick rests on a table, satisfied for the moment, as you breathe in for 4 and out for 6. And let the very specific, very wooden world of herring barrels become pleasantly indistinct. You might not expect a mystery to be made mostly of receipts, scissors, and the absence of labels, but that is often how it starts. Not with a dramatic speech, not with a chase scene. Just with a quiet, ordinary landscape doing what landscapes do, and an object placed where it shouldn't be, like someone left a comma in the middle of a sentence and walked away. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the outside world be a soft blur. And in a whisper, you don't have to answer out loud. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? If you're still awake a few minutes from now, you can subscribe. Or don't, it's okay. I promise I won't send a detective to your door to ask why. This is bedtime history, and the only thing we investigate aggressively here is how long a person can think about paperwork before their eyelids quietly resign. In Norway, not far from Bergen, there is a valley called Isdal, a place that can sound like a name from a fairy tale, but behaves like a real valley. Cold air, narrow walls, the kind of dampness that makes rocks look permanently thoughtful. It's the sort of place people hike through to clear their head, which is an ironic choice when the valley is later associated with a case that refuses to clear anyone's head at all. The discovery begins in the way so many discoveries do, by someone who is not looking for history or mystery or anything heavier than a normal day. A jogger, a walker, a person moving through the landscape, noticing something that doesn't fit. And the valley, which usually holds only wind and quiet, holds on to this detail too. When investigators arrive, the work is not cinematic. It is careful, slow, and full of small boundaries. There are strings, markers, notes. There are measured steps and gloved hands and the particular tone people use when they are trying to stay professional near something unsettling. In the sleepless version of events, what stands out is not the harm, but the process. A scene becomes a set of categories. What is on the ground? What is under it? What is nearby? What is missing? What seems deliberately arranged, and what simply fell where gravity told it to? Even the air has a role because cold air preserves some things and hides others, and rain will politely wash away meaning without asking permission. And then there are the objects that want to be remembered, not because they are grand, but because someone chose them. A watch, a ring, items that are ordinary until they become evidence, and then they become oddly loud, as if metal can speak by reflecting the same question again and again. You can almost feel the way the mind of an investigator must shift into lists, because lists are comforting. A list has edges, a list has a bottom. A mystery does not, and that's exhausting for anyone who likes closure, including most humans and also most filing cabinets. As the initial scene settles into documentation, another scene appears, quieter but maybe even stranger in a bureaucratic way. A key, a station, a suitcase waiting in a place where suitcases are meant to wait, except this one is now waiting for the wrong person, like a coat checked forever. Left luggage is such a calm modern idea. Just store your things, pick them up later, trust the system. It's almost charming that a society can invent a service whose entire philosophy is, we will keep your bag safe while you do something else. And yet, in cases like this, the system works too well. The bag is kept, the bag remains. The bag becomes a question with a handle. Inside, the details are not about treasure. They are about choices. Clothing, personal items, and the odd feeling of someone trying to exist without leaving a trace that points back to them. Labels cut out, not torn, not accidentally worn away cut. It's such a specific act. It is not the kind of thing you do in a hurry unless you really enjoy tedious tasks, and the human species, to be fair, does sometimes enjoy tedious tasks when it thinks it's being clever. There might be wigs, cosmetics, small tools of appearance and movement, the sort of items that make you think of travel and temporary identity. There is the peculiar logic of removing maker's marks while keeping the object itself, like erasing the title of a book but still reading it. And then the little details that make it feel almost domestic despite everything. A spoon, perhaps, or items with a known place of manufacture, which is exactly the sort of thing detectives love and hate. They love it because it's a clue. They hate it because everything is a clue, and clues are heavy when there are too many. A prescription vial, scraped clean of its most informative words, sitting there with the quiet stubbornness of glass. Even the zipper on the suitcase becomes part of the atmosphere, teeth closing a mouth, holding a story that does not want to be spoken plainly. From there, the case drifts into one of the most sleep-inducing realms in all of human affairs. Names and rooms, hotels, registers, booking cards. There is something deeply calming about the idea that even a person determined to be untraceable still has to sleep somewhere, and sleeping somewhere tends to involve a form. A clerk with a pen, a desk with a drawer, a question asked in polite tones. In this case, multiple names appear aliases used across different locations, across different nights, as if a person moved through the world, wearing a slightly different label each time, which is funny in a dull way because labels were also being removed from clothing. It's like the entire theme of the case is labels, but not too many labels, and definitely not the official ones. The hotel routines are their own quiet theater. Someone arrives alone. Someone asks for a room that is quiet, perhaps, or a room with a certain view, because views are a safe thing to discuss when you want to sound normal. Someone pays cash, which always has that historical charm of being both practical and mildly suspicious, depending on what century you're in and how bored the police are. A clerk remembers a strong perfume, because scent travels differently than faces do. A clerk remembers sunglasses on a cloudy day, which is either a fashion choice or a very mild attempt to control how much the world looks back at you. None of this is dramatic. It is just human behavior written down by people who were paid to be attentive to strangers. And every time the person leaves, the room resets. Sheets changed. Waste bins emptied. The mirror keeps reflecting whoever stands in front of it next, without any loyalty to the past. Hotels are excellent at forgetting, which is part of what makes them restful and part of what makes them frustrating for investigation. The whole building is designed to treat each stay as temporary and mostly irrelevant. It's a machine that turns human presence into cleanliness and then into absence. If you want to disappear politely, a hotel will help you, and it won't even realize it's helping. Somewhere in these travels, there is also the quietest kind of code, numbers. Not a dramatic cipher carved into stone. Just a small notebook with tidy pairs, dates, and notes that look ordinary until someone decides they are not. A ledger of movements rather than feelings. Ferries, trips, days, small calculations of time that feel like someone organizing their life the way you organize a calendar you don't fully trust. And investigators do what investigators always do with numbers. They try to match them to timetables, to tickets, to arrivals and departures, to the stubborn reality of schedules. The funny thing about schedules is that they are both reliable and full of tiny holes. A ferry runs at certain hours, but people miss ferries. A train arrives, but people step off and immediately stop existing in the record. A hotel night can be paid for, but what happens between check-in and check-out is mostly left to the universe. So the notebook becomes a kind of spine, a structure that suggests order, while meaning stays seated in its chair, arms crossed, refusing to explain itself. You can breathe in for 4 and out for 6, and imagine a detective doing the same because the numbers line up, but the person behind them does not. When a case moves into forensics, it becomes, in many ways, even more procedural. Teeth, tissue, traces, the careful reading of a body the way one reads a document quietly, respectfully, looking for what can be supported rather than what is merely suggested. Dental work can point toward regions, toward clinics, toward broad histories of childhood and care. It's oddly intimate, the way teeth keep records without trying. Enamel does not gossip. It just exists, and then experts interpret it with tools and training and the patience of people who are comfortable with very small measurements. There are also the traces of substances, which, if we keep the tone gentle, can be described as the sort of medical and chemical details that investigators document because bodies interact with the world, and the world leaves footprints. Some findings suggest fire and smoke, but we don't need to linger on the harshness of that. In a sleepy telling, what matters is that the investigation tries to separate sequence from assumption. What happened first? What happened later? What is certain? What is probable? What is merely possible? It's a style of thinking that is both calming and maddening, like sorting beads into color groups while knowing someone might have mixed them again. Clothing, too, becomes a silent witness. Fibers retain hints. What kind of environment? What kind of handling? What kind of wear? Paraffin traces, perhaps, or soot, or the small smudges of ordinary movement that become meaningful only because someone is no longer around to explain them. Even fingertips can be read, whether someone worked with certain materials, whether they handled heat, whether their life involved travel and friction, and the quiet labor of doing things with their hands. None of it is a confession. It is just a record, and records are stubbornly unemotional. And then there is the human side again, which in this case often arrives as recollected impressions, a foreign accent, perhaps remembered by witnesses as shifting slightly from place to place, which is a fascinatingly mundane concept. Imagine trying on accents the way you try on jackets, hoping each one fits the weather and the room. Or imagine an accent that sounded foreign simply because the listener couldn't place it, because the brain loves categories and gets cranky when it can't file a sound properly. Either way, it becomes another note on another page, and the pile of pages grows until the case is physically heavy. As investigators reconstruct the last week's movements, the story, such as it is, becomes a map made of ordinary transactions. A ticket purchased, a taxi ride remembered, a shop visit that seems tiny until it becomes one of the only fixed points. Sunglasses bought on a day that didn't demand them. A scarf, 2 cases rather than one. A clerk who remembers a posture rather than a face, because posture is sometimes what sticks in the mind when names do not. Receipts appear like small islands, proof that on this day, at this hour, a person stood at a counter and exchanged money for something. It is almost comforting that paper can be so confident about such small moments. But receipts also offer a kind of cruel clarity. They can explain a date and a place and nothing else. They can confirm that a person was present without confirming why. And so the file begins to feel like a museum of known facts, with thick glass between those facts and any satisfying interpretation. The file can close for the night. The questions do not. They sit in the dark like chairs waiting to be used again. Eventually, when the physical evidence has been cataloged and the timeline has been sketched as neatly as it can be, the case enters the realm of theories. This is where people sometimes get loud, because theories invite imagination, and imagination can sprint even when evidence prefers to walk. But we're keeping this gentle, and we're keeping it sleepy, which means we treat theories the way you treat items in a drawer. You pick one up, you look at it, you put it back, and you don't pretend it's a crown just because it's shiny. Espionage is one of the louder guesses, partly because it fits the era in a broad, atmospheric way. Cold War Norway, military sites, routes that shadow ports. The idea of a person with multiple identities moving through a network of quiet meetings and coded notes. It's the sort of theory that comes with its own soundtrack in people's heads, which is exactly why we should keep it on mute. Smuggling is the quieter guess, less glamorous, more plausible in the boring sense. Valuables traveling well. Cash payments, a preference for corners and exits. The kind of work that involves logistics rather than ideology, like moving objects while trying to remain unseen. There are also theories that are almost painfully human, personal flight from a past, debt, marriage, a life someone wanted to end without leaving an address. These ideas feel close to the skin, which is why we handle them softly. The truth is that any story that tries too hard to explain everything tends to become a performance rather than an argument. In real investigations, each idea holds together for a page, then loosens up the spine when you turn the evidence slightly and see what doesn't match. But listening is not failure. It is honesty. It is the case reminding you that not all gaps are meant to be filled by confidence. And because the case remains unfinished, it accumulates a particular kind of second life. It becomes a file that people return to, generation after generation, hoping that new methods, new archives, or a single overlooked detail might help. Sometimes a case like this becomes a mirror for whatever era is looking at it. One decade sees spies, another sees organized crime, another sees bureaucracy failing at something it desperately wants to succeed at. The mystery stays the same, but the interpretations change outfits, which is almost fitting given the theme of changing names and removing labels. Now, to bring it back to something that can rest easily in the mind, let's think about the gentle mechanics of unfinished cases as a historical phenomenon. Every society has them. Old missing person notices. Unidentified remains. Records that end mid-sentence because the person writing them ran out of information, not ink. And what people do with such cases says something quiet about their relationship with certainty. Some cultures prefer decisive stories even when wrong. Others can tolerate ambiguity a little longer, at least on paper. Investigations themselves become a form of public ritual. We looked, we measured, we compared, we filed, we cared enough to try. So here is a bedtime oath for unfinished cases, spoken with the soft respect of someone closing a folder gently. Keep facts in one jar, the valley, the suitcase, the cut labels. The hotel cards, the notebook numbers, the dental work, the receipts, the remembered perfume, the sunglasses on a cloudy day. Keep stories in another jar labeled lightly, open rarely. Add one small check tomorrow. Remove one dramatic certainty tonight. If a new detail arrives, let it touch only what it matches and let the rest keep sleeping. The valley cools. The station clock turns. Paper rests under its own weight. The file waits, patient and unsolved, with its labels burned clean, and the world continues its quiet habit of moving on one timetable, one receipt, one name written neatly on a line. As you breathe out slowly and let the idea of knowing everything become less important than the gentle comfort of letting some questions remain, for now, undisturbed.